One of the great pillars of Western culture is our democratic institutions. It seems unsurprising then that we owe it, like we do so many other things, to the ancient Greeks. So how did they make the leap from tyrant to ballot box, and exactly how democratic were their institutions? Joining me today to answer these questions and many more is Paul Cartledge, A.G. Leventis Professor of Greek Culture Emeritus at Clare College, Cambridge. He's written innumerable books on the ancient world, with his most recent publication, Democracy Alive, being shortlisted for the Runciman Award. And he's also being welcomed back to the podcast. He did one for the first series. So welcome back, Professor Cartledge.
Thank you very much, Oscar.
So to open the discussion and ensure we're looking at things on your terms, what is democracy to you?
It's exactly what it was to Winston Churchill. It's the worst political system in the entire whole world, apart from all the others, which is a famous quotation. What he meant was that it, of course, has inherent weaknesses. For example, populism, rhetoric, emotion, ignorance of the vote, all the stuff which actually these accusations have been levelled against democracy since the very, very beginnings. We'll come back to the origins of democracy later on. But more importantly to me, it's the only system, viable system, which is not in some way autocratic, tyrannical, in some way demeaning of individual citizens. So which gives individual citizens a say and which decides major issues in public after ideally rational discussion on a majority basis, with every voter counting for one and no one for more than one. So it's based on freedom and equality, which is exactly what ancient democracy was based on, except that, and we'll explore this further later, there's no such thing as just one kind of democracy. Democracy varies with the culture, the time, and all the personalities, all the other reasons why different political systems differ. So democracies differ.
And then bringing it back to ancient Greece, at roughly what period does democracy in Greece emerge? And how and why, I suppose, it seems unusual that they make the leap from what were essentially tyrannical states.
You're right that in Athens, immediately before a democracy, there was a kind of tyranny. Tyranny meaning one person, autocratic, non-responsible rule based typically on force, with possibly an explicit overt bodyguard. But at any rate, the tyrant is non-responsible, and that's quite true. It is odd, it's a paradox. But the Athenians, I'll just stick with them for the moment, they made a virtue of this paradox, because for them, the icons of democracy, their culture heroes, were two, as they called them, tyrannicides, people who had killed the tyrant. Well, actually, historically, as Thucydides showed, the history was not accurate. Athenians had a false myth of how and why they became a democratic state. But it was very important that they should have had such a myth, because they needed to be persuaded that their way, the democratic way, the masses ruling, was better. Now, I've used the word masses. Demokratia, the Greek word, is ambiguous. It can mean either the rule of the people, the demos, or it can mean the rule of the majority of the poor people, the masses in that sense. So it's in its origins, the very word is somewhat controversial and ambivalent. And actually the word seems to have come after the thing. In other words, the Athenians had what I would call a proto-democracy, a form of democracy, before any Athenian coined the word demokratia.
Okay.
Perhaps I should add, sorry, I didn't actually give you a date. I think you might like to have that. So we're talking about the decades on either side of 500 BC, something that was later looked back to rightly as a democratic reform was introduced about 508 BC. But the word democracy is not attested until about 425 BC, so another 80 years later, though it probably was in existence somewhere around 470 BC.
I see. And how was this sort of proto-democracy, as you describe it, and then going on into sort of a more developed democracy, how exactly did the Greeks structure it?
Right, well, I'm not going to talk
Athenians,
yet about... No, absolutely, I'm not going to talk yet about the Greeks as a whole. We're going to come back to the issue of just how widespread was it. But the Athenians invented it, and they, in fact, developed it further than any other of the many hundreds of other Greek states which had a version of democracy. But the key invention, and it was credited to an Athenian called Cleisthenes, was to invent a council in permanent session chosen by the use of the lot, which is the democratic way of choosing people to perform a political function because it's random. It privileges nobody because they're smarter or richer or more beautiful than anybody else. Everybody has the equal chance of getting selected by lot. That's the democratic way. And it's in permanent session because if you're an ordinary Athenian, you pitch up at the assembly, which is held originally probably once a month. So let's say 10 to 12 times a year. You depend on a permanent body to process the information on which you are going to make your decision, being persuaded by one or other orator. So the three structural elements are Council of 500, speakers or politicians, and the voters, that is the assembly. Cleisthenes saw that what was crucial was that somehow the whole of the state should feel they had a stake in the system. So he based his democracy on the village, the unit of habitation, which in Greek is a demos, the very same word as demos, meaning people. So democratia is rule from the demes as well as rule by the people. The demes is where you learn to become a citizen. You get enrolled, you are taking part in various rituals, religious and otherwise. You have a mayor who may be elected, chosen by lot. This is local democracy. On that basis, you then participate at the, as it were, national level, where you're advised by speakers, you're persuaded by speakers, and the whole program, the agenda of the assembly is managed by the council, which also pursues the decisions you take in the assembly. They enact through distributing money, through appointing officials, and so on and so on. The council is the key enabling organ of the Athenian democracy.
And then at the top of all of this structure, is there kind of a state official or a state head similar to a prime minister or a Taoiseach?
Well, interestingly not, partly because they, unlike us, did not have a government. They had no notion of parties, so politicians represent themselves. They don't represent a party. And there was no ever at the head of any democratic state, any one individual. That would have seemed much too much like the tyranny that they just got rid of. Now, there is case, and of course this is somewhat controversial, but Pericles, Athenian politician of the middle of the 5th century, second half of the 5th century BC, Thucydides, writing about him, speaks as if he was almost a sort of uncrowned king of Athens because his authority was so terrific. But Thucydides, being honest, also records that the people deposed Pericles perfectly legally, not by some coup, but simply by due legal process. That doesn't seem to me to be consistent with calling Pericles anything like a prime minister, president, or Taoiseach.
How did their voting system work? How did they go about electing these politicians?
Right. The first point to distinguish is between different modes of selecting people to hold vital positions. And the democratic way, as I said, is by the use of the lot. So most people who held any kind of office, let's say, looking after keeping the streets clean. I mean, it's very humble, but that's not an unimportant function. Most of them were chosen by lot. However, there are two types of official, two types of executive officers who were elected by show of hands. On the one hand, the generals, the chief army officials. On the other, the chief finance officers of the state. They were elected, and the quid pro quo was, in a democracy, they must be scrutinized. They must be made responsible, held responsible, even more closely, tightly, carefully than officials who were chosen by lot, because they were dealing with large amounts of public money, and there was a risk both of wastage and of bribery. And generals were, of course, in charge of strategy and tactics on the battlefield, which might be on land or by sea. The Athenians were a naval power.
And then these ones who were put under scrutiny, they were elected. Were there rules and limitations regarding who could vote and who could engage with this?
Well, the citizen, by definition, is adult, male, free, legitimate. The Athenians were unusual in that they gradually tightened the rules for eligibility for citizenship, such that you had to have a citizen mother as well as a citizen father. You had to have a married pair of parents, legitimately married, and so on. Granted that we're talking only about citizens, so no women, no unfree people, so no slaves, and no foreigners. And there were in Athens lots and lots of resident foreigners who were free and maybe Greek, but they were not empowered because the Athenians took a very strong and narrow view that citizenship was somehow a family affair, so you have to be related. It's a matter of descent. So how did the system work? Well, there are various arenas in which political decision-making occurs. One, and most prominently the one that we read about most, is the assembly. So is Athens going to go to war? Is Athens going to make peace? Who makes the decision? The assembly. And they voted by show of hands, which were counted. And it's thought that a typical attendance at an assembly would be of the order of 6,000 people. So it'd take quite a long time if you were to count every individual vote. But actually it seems they would sort of look and guesstimate. And it was only if things looked really tight, they would then have an individual head count with a pebble or something like that. That's in the assembly. In the law courts, which were also political arenas, because the Athenians didn't make a distinction between the judicature and the carrying out of justice and the decision-making in the assembly. This is all politics. It's all democracy. And in the law court, you have as many as sometimes 6,000 actually, but typically 500. And they have two kinds of ballots, the two kinds of bronze tokens, one guilty, one not guilty. And then in some cases, they would vote again on if it's a fine, how big the fine was, and that sort of thing. So there are different ways in which only citizens are empowered to vote at all, and they would vote differently by show of hands in the assembly, by individual ballot in the law courts.
And just to go back to that, you talk about the sort of the narrow definitions of citizenship. Was there a way that, let's say you were originally a foreigner, but your parents had moved to Greece, or to Athens, sorry, and you'd been born in Athens, was there any way that you could assume citizenship, or did it only come through the lineage?
It came only through the lineage unless you happened to make a particular benefaction. That's to say, you were very rich, you were an arms manufacturer, and you said, right, I'm going to give the Athenians 500 free shields. I'm just going to give them. Then somebody might propose you for citizenship. It's a very complicated ritual. You had to propose the name to the council. Council would then say, yes, it's okay. It can go on the agenda. The meeting occurs. Somebody steps up. I propose. I second. There's a vote. And you had to have at least 6,000 people for that vote to be valid. And of course, the majority of the 6,000 had to be in favour. Then another meeting, the next week, just in case people found out stuff about this proposed new citizen, that actually he was deeply corrupt. He'd sent money to the Spartans, and so he really shouldn't ever be given citizenship. You have a confirmatory vote. So the answer is very, very few Greeks who were not Athenian born made it from being a resident of Athens, or even born in Athens to non-Athenian parents, into the Athenian citizen body. Very few.
And you talk about the the parliament or the votes being of 6,000 people. So there's in and around 6,000 voting citizens in ancient Athens. Compared to the total population of Athens, how many are allowed vote within Athens?
Right.
You know?
So two types of comparison. How many was 5,000 to 6,000 out of the potentially eligible Athenian citizen body? We think that the normal figure was of the order of 30,000 adult male Athenian citizens properly born, registered and eligible. So 5,000-6,000 works out at something like 20% for each one. But whereas for us, we would think that's rather a low percentage. I mean, we tend to operate in the order of 50% plus of the eligible vote. Sometimes in a recent general election, it went up to 70 odd here, and in some others, it's been even higher. Nevertheless, they reckoned that any 6,000 who pitched up would be roughly the same in their economic composition, their intellectual background, their affiliations and so on, geographically, whatever, as any other 6,000. So it really didn't matter whether it was much more than that.
So they voted in the system in the way that we conduct polls.
Something like that. It was like a sample, exactly right, a sampling. And then on the other hand, you might say, okay, what was the total population of the city-estate of Athens, the whole 1,000 square miles of Athens, 2,400 square kilometers? Well, more like 1 in 15. Something, if there were, let's say, as many as 250,000, 300,000 people, well, 30,000 out of that is of the order of only, a seventh, an eighth, something like that. And then if of those eighths, only a fifth of that eighth vote, you're getting down to quite a small percentage of the total population.
And then let's say you had these, how would you go about proposing a law in Athens, like or an amendment to a law? How did they legislate?
Absolutely right. Well, there's distinction drawn up. I mean, it takes a bit of time before they work it out, between a decree, which is ad hoc, so it's a specific issue or it affects a particular group of people, and a law, which is general. It has no particular application to any one case or any one group of people. And that had a slightly tougher procedure than the proposal of a decree, which might be, should we go to war or should we restrict the citizenship or something like that. And so what you have to do is you make your proposal and in writing and you submit it to the council, and the council is in permanent session. So the group of councillors out of the 500 who are currently the 50 in session, they would receive it, process it. The next council meeting before an assembly meeting, this motion will be put to the council, and the council has a choice then either to accept it as it is and put it on with its approval on the next agenda of the assembly, or to say we're not taking a view ourselves, it's entirely up to you in the assembly, but here is the motion on the agenda and X will speak for it because he proposed it to us. So you then have the discussion for and against. You have speakers popping up saying, but that clause there is, and there would be professional politicians who would study the agenda of the assembly before the assembly meeting, and they would have their prepared points to make. They wouldn't just hear it, oh my goodness, and then think, well, I'm going to amend that. They would have got their amendments prepared. You'd then have the assembly accepting a version, either as the original proposal or as amended. That would then go to actually public slaves whose job was to write it up, to preserve it up, first of all on papyrus, and then it would be recorded in public. Athenians are very hot on decisions made by the people being inspectable, available, open, transparent for the people.
And behind this, was there a kind of a constitution? Did they have a set of kind of groundwork?
There were lots and lots of regulations, laws, partly passed before the democracy came into being, partly under the democracy. And there was a crisis at the end of the 5th century BC, provoked by a defeat, a major defeat in a very long war against Sparta, which Athens lost. And there was a lot of recrimination within the Athenians, who made the mistakes, why did we lose, who can we blame? And actually right at the end, the Spartans imposed upon the Athenians a non-democratic and I would say anti-democratic oligarchic system of government. Well, once that was removed for complicated reasons, the Athenians then took it upon themselves to look at their entire set of past regulations, legislation, laws, decrees, and try to reduce them to some kind of order. And that's the nearest they got to having a code of a constitution in that sense, a written constitution. But it's not very close, actually. It still remains somewhat random and somewhat ragged.
And you mentioned there Sparta, which we talked about in the last podcast, and it's very much not quite as democratic as Athens. But were there any other policies that had democracy or that had a form of democracy?
Well, there were something like 1,000 Greek polis in the entire Greek world, which of course covered the whole Mediterranean and also around the Black Sea in the 5th and 4th centuries. We don't know exactly how many of them had any form of democracy, but we guess something like maybe as many as a couple of hundred at any one time. But what we do know is, and this is thanks to Aristotle, the analyst of Greek politics, though he himself was not a citizen of Athens, he lived in Athens, he was a resident foreigner because he was not born of Athenian stock. And he distinguished 4 grades of democracy in ascending order of more and more people power. In other words, the masses have more. And so Athens, for him, represented the most extreme form of people power, where ordinary people actually ran the state. They didn't merely assent to proposals put to them by elites who then really ran the show. They, the people, ruled. So there was no one ancient Greek democracy, no one kind. The Athenians had, we think, 3 or 4 over a couple of 100 years period, different sorts of democracy, responding to different situations. And most Greek cities probably never, most of the 1,000 probably never had any kind of democracy. So they were some sort of oligarchy, rule of the few, whereas the Athenians were the most democratic, and relatively few, or at least probably fewer than half, of all the 1,000 ever had any form of democracy.
And you mentioned there that there were sort of 3 or 4 different democratic systems. How did democracy change during the various periods of Athenian history? Right.
Well, the Athenian particular case is that, first of all, you have what I call a proto-democracy from about 500 to about 460. There was then a kind of revolution led by 2 men, one of whom was Pericles, the other Ephialtes, who was murdered. And that probably means that he was murdered by people who didn't like the fact that Athens was becoming more democratic. And the change was specifically that the ordinary people, through the courts, were acquiring greater power of control over the elite than they had had before. I've mentioned the defeat in the Great War at the end of the 5th century, which generated certain internal changes to democracy, the most important of which was the sharp distinction between a decree, which is just temporary, ad hoc, ad hominem, and a law, which is a permanent general regulation. And the Athenians had a different way of deciding on a decree from a law. And the point of it was this. In the Peloponnesian War, when things were going badly, there'd been a coup, an anti-democratic oligarchic coup. The point of the reform, distinguishing between law and decree, was that the people in assembly never again could vote themselves out, could never introduce a non-democratic constitution just by a vote of one single assembly.
Okay. And then obviously there was sort of this period where democracy went into decline in Greece.
Right.
How and why did it go into decline?
In a way, there was a sort of, it's not just specific to Athens, this, but there does seem to be throughout the Greek world, in the 4th century BC, as we call it, after 400 BC, a rise of autocrats, tyrants, you call that. And in Sicily, you have the tyranny of Dionysius of Syracuse, very powerful figure, the most powerful single individual in that part of the Greek world in the first half of the 4th century. In the north of Greece, that is Aegean Greece, you have the rise of Macedon, and the Macedonian monarchy was an autocratic, traditional monarchy based on power, based on force, with the army being the principal instrument whereby the autocrat expressed and delivered his views. And so what happens in the 4th century BC is that the democracies, the major ones, Argos, Thebes, Athens, come up against, they're in conflict with this rising monarchy of Macedon, which defeats them in battle. And it's a very simple case of the democracies not being able to resist the rise of Macedon. And within Athens, there had always been, if you like, an opposition. There were always people who thought democracy was a terrible system for various reasons, but mainly because it gave much too much power to ordinary poor people as opposed to elite people. So they were actually quite happy when the Athenian democracy was defeated and joined with, willingly, the Macedonian conquerors in introducing a new non- or anti-democratic system in which they were much more prominent politically, where their wealth was not so much available to be used for the masses' entertainment or for the fleet, which often propped up a democratic rule in other cities and so on. So it's really basically a matter of military power and the democracies losing. Thereafter, Alexander the Great, who was, of course, the great conqueror of the Persian Empire, but his dad, Philip, who had wanted to be the great conqueror of the Persian Empire but was assassinated, Philip had conquered the Greek cities. So Alexander took over Philip's control of mainland Greece, then extended that through his conquests of the Persian Empire. And after his very premature, really, death, he was only 32, that Greek world expanded, which now extended as far as Pakistan in the east, was fought over for a generation or two, until after about 50 years after Alexander's death, we're in the early part of the 3rd century BC, the Greek world is divided up into 3 or 4 territorial monarchies, none of whom had any interest in supporting democracy or thinking democracy was a good thing. They preferred to deal with elites in the Greek cities who would be more sympathetic to their kind of monarchy than had it been in a democratic system.
And then you mentioned there that there was always sort of an opposition to democracy within Athens. Was the notion of Greek democracy popular among everyone in Athens, or I suppose mainly the aristocracy? And to further that question, how did the writers and historians such as Thucydides and Herodotus of the 5th and 4th centuries BC perceive democracy? Was it all positive or was it negative?
A very good question. That the word democratia in itself was open to rival interpretations. One is rule of the people, by the people, or for the people, sort of an anodyne, quite positive notion. The other notion is the demos is the masses. So it's the rule of the poor masses over the elite, the few elite who are cleverer, wealthier, better born, better educated. And so since the writers, by and large, by definition almost, came from the elite group, the few rather than the many, most of them were not terribly sympathetic to democracy in principle. And Aristotle and of course, Plato, his teacher, are very good examples of that. However, just as politicians differed, they took harder or softer lines on the rule of the people. So theoreticians, philosophers, intellectuals, they also took harder or softer lines. And Aristotle took a softer line on democracy. Plato took an extremely hard, negative line. And at root was the belief of democrats that if you're a citizen, legally speaking, that's it. You are equal in principle to every other citizen. The critics of democracy took the view that people actually are not equal functionally. So they may be equal by birth, by status, but they are more or less clever, more or less rich, more or less good-looking, more or less well-educated. And if you're an elitist, if you're an anti-democrat, you don't like the fact that your vote, your say, your contribution is constantly overwhelmed by the simple majority principle, the numbers of the masses. So most of our written literature about democracy is more or less hostile to it. I mean, that's a paradox, but it's a fact. And one of the reasons why, and we can come on to this very shortly, is that ancient democracy was not like our democracy in one key respect. It was direct. So the masses rule directly through mass meetings. And there is no immediate check on them. It's not representative. It's not indirect. It's not mediated democracy. It's in-your-face democracy. So you asked about Thucydides and Herodotus. These are the sort of founding fathers of ancient Greek history. And democracy features centrally in both of them. And in fact, the word democracy is first attested in Herodotus. Now, he, it seems, had a relatively more positive attitude to democracy than did Thucydides. Thucydides was prepared to accept democracy if a Pericles, as it were, kept the masses in check. So acted as a kind of, well, almost a kind of prime minister or president or some sort of nice autocratic tyrant, though actually that was not the case of Pericles' position, as I've already said. But he was against democracy as such because the masses tended to make, in his view, bad decisions. Herodotus, on the other hand, saw some merit in the freedom aspect of democracy. One of the reasons why Athens became a democracy was they'd had a tyranny before. Tyranny is a form of oppression, depriving ordinary people and the masses, the majority, of freedom. So Herodotus liked freedom. He liked the fact that democracy was an expression of popular will.
Moving on then to, obviously, you talked earlier about how it had died out at a certain point.
Or was murdered, really, in some way.
in Greek history, and the Romans had it to some extent, not quite to the same.
They had a very interesting system in my book. I have a whole chapter because it's been argued that the form whereby the people, they call themselves populus Romanus, voted, and they took decisions of election, legislation, peace and war and so on. Therefore, that looks like a form of democracy. I had to be really quite detailed and careful to unpick just different ways in which the Romans' form of decision-making would not have been considered democratic by a Greek democrat. And one of the obvious ones is that the Romans did not have the notion of one citizen, one vote. They weighted citizens' votes so that the richer had a more powerful say.
So my question then stands is, how did, considering it died out, and obviously it died out in Rome under Caesar, the very famous story, how did it manage to reinvent itself in a more recent history?
Right. Well, that's, again, a very complex, tangled tale. It starts roughly in the 17th century, where people, especially in this country, the so-called English Revolution, they see monarchy, especially absolute monarchy, especially divine right monarchy, as no longer appropriate.
You're talking about Cromwell and
We're
his...
talking about the Levellers, we're talking about Cromwell's New Model Army, we're talking about the anti-Charles I movement, which was associated with Parliament. And this is the origins, ultimately, of the United Kingdom's form of indirect parliamentary representative democracy. And the people, so if you like, the Levellers and others were Republicans, but they were not yet Democrats, because the issue was, who should have the vote, the franchise, the suffrage. And it took another 250 years, the early 20th century, before we have full adult suffrage in the UK with the admission of women to the vote. So it's not a simple thing, but the word itself was not first used because democracy had all the bad connotations of mob rule, of tyranny of the majority, poor decision-making, and all the criticisms that come from the tradition with Thucydides, Plato, Aristotle. And the Romans were not Greek-style democrats. So how come the word became acceptable when and only when a very watered-down form of people power, that is very indirect, only a few people to begin with were entitled to vote and stand for Parliament and exercise power, make laws and carry them out, and all that. So it's a gradual process. The word democracy becomes more and more acceptable gradually as the more and more of the people are incorporated, but always on the basis that the direct contribution by you and me, ordinary citizens, is relatively small.
Okay, and then talking of these temporary democrats, or more contemporary democrats, I should say, of the 17th, 18th, 19th, and 20th century, as it was reinventing itself, did they pay heed to what the Greeks gave them, or did they take anything from the Greeks?
The answer to that is pretty much nothing, because it was an alien tradition, very small states and many, many states instead of unitary nation states. And of course, the way in which the ancient Greeks did politics, face to face, in public, in small spaces, with slaves and others, which were no longer acceptable in modern society. So actually, no, there is very little direct Greek thinking behind the development of modern democracy from the 17th century on.
Is it fair to say then that in some ways our modern democracy isn't owed to the Greeks in quite the same way that I think most people would perceive it to be?
Well, it's, I think, a mistake based on the similarity or the identity of the name, and that is, I think, confusing. So it's better to think of modern democracy as starting out as republicanism, which is, of course, a Latin-based term, and only becoming democracy of a different kind, namely representative, indirect, parliamentary, as opposed to the ancient Greeks kind, which was quite threatening and quite, as I say, class-based, in-your-face, oppositional, not consensual, and it lacked, of course, any party political dimension. So there are all sorts of institutional ways and practical ways in which one wouldn't want to recreate or introduce ancient Greek ideas.
Now, you've touched on it throughout the podcast, but I suppose just to sum it up in one answer, what are the main differences between modern and ancient democracy?
I would put them down to this fundamental distinction between a representative system, which is where we, the people, do not rule, but we choose people to rule for us, and to rule for us in two senses. On our behalf, we hope, but also instead of us. So we, the people, are the enablers. We get the system going. We choose our politicians, and we choose between rival politicians, partly on basis of their individual personalities, partly on the basis of the party allegiances that they advocate. But the difference is that we then, that's it. until and the next election comes around, or some catastrophe happens as a crisis, as we are currently going through in our country, and then there may be some irregular imposition of popular intervention, inevitably. But normally speaking, we the people are out of the political process on a day-to-day basis. In the ancient world, politics was direct, in your face. Popular rule meant people, ordinary people, actually ruled.
And now to bring it all together at the end, if I could only take three things away from this podcast about ancient democracy, what would you want them to be and why?
Right. Talking about ancient as compared with modern, I would say, first of all, that the study of the history of democracy from the ancients to today tells me there's no one such thing as democracy. There are lots and lots of different sorts of democracies, within which there might be a couple of common elements, namely some definition of equality, some definition of freedom, which sets democracy apart from all other kinds of political rule of a more or less oligarchic or autocratic kind. Secondly, democracy is not easily acquired, and it's not easily retained. So it's, if you like, a tender plant that has to be nurtured and nourished and not taken for granted. You have to work at it. And one of the reasons you have to work at it, this is my third point, is that democracy isn't just what happens in Parliament or in ancient Greece in the assembly or the law courts. It's a culture. And so it's not just the institutions of power and decision-making, but an attitude of going on together, how one should live a life in society in a political form. And there's a Greek word which means literally instruction of children, paideia. But it also meant education in a broader sense. And Pericles is made to say, in a famous work, a famous oration, that Athens was a kind of education for all of Greece, ancient Greece. Well, in the same way, I think democracy is a mode whereby one must be educated in order to do it. You can't just do it. You have to be brought up to do it, and you have to be taught what its ins and outs, its virtues, its vices are. And I'm a little bit despondent at some of the ways in which our democracy is currently being practiced through, I think, a failure to teach its sophistication, its nuances sufficiently in school and in other forums.
Well, that brings us nicely to the end of the podcast. Professor Cartledge, thank you so much for joining me for what was another excellent podcast.
Thank you very much, Oscar, for inviting me.
And if you at home enjoyed today's podcast and want to find out more about the work we do, get in touch via our social media outlets at www.facebook.com/Classical Youth Society of Ireland. You can follow us on Twitter at CYSI_, or if you want to get in touch directly, you can email us cysiofficial@gmail.com. This series of Conversing the Classics was made possible by the Classical Association of Ireland, and today's episode was edited by Michael Fuller. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll see you all next time.